HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Dogs of Avalon, The Race to Save Animals in Peril, by Laura Schenone, read by Esther Wane. Part 1. Prologue. A flash of fur and bones, she flung the car door open and, without a moment's hesitation, was running across the fields, dressed in evening clothes and high-heeled shoes. They'd been on their way out to dinner with friends, but there was no choice at all but for her to run across the field, around the farmhouse, past bales of hay stacked like a wall. Perhaps she paused for a moment to call out to some farmer's wife standing there. "Did you see the dog? Did you see the dog?" Of course she hadn't. She ran across a cattle guard and into tall grass. Everything else disappeared. The friends waiting at the restaurant, the husband aggravated in the car. Everything disappeared except for the animal in the field, running in the half-light. It was as if she and the creature were somehow one, the chased and the chaser. The only thing that existed was the sound of her own panting and the pace of her legs in sync with those of the animal. Later, how much later she couldn't say, she returned to the car with the mutt in her arms. And what a filthy, ragged one it was, a cowering mess of bones. There was always a leash and a blanket in the back seat. Her husband gave a loud sigh, but otherwise was silent as he turned the car around and headed back home. Years later, Marion told me the story early on, so that I would understand how it worked, that it was like a big wave that comes and carries you off. Then you're gone. Chapter 1. Wild, 1993. Marion stood in the hallway in a hospital gown, phone to her ear, trying to ignore the other cancer patients waiting in line behind her. The phone constantly rang for Marion, and by the time she'd gathered herself up from the bed and hauled her IV down the hall, a queue would already be forming. Cancer was hard enough without standing in line to make a phone call. The other patients had long ago lost patience with her. This was the early 1990s, when Ireland was a poor nation. Some people were fond of calling it the last third-world country of Western Europe. They had a point, when you looked at the hospitals. Marion's room had 5 beds in it, and more than a dozen patients shared a single toilet. There was one phone for the entire floor. "Marion Fitzgibbon, it's for you. Again." It seemed like she got a dozen calls a day. Finally, someone asked, "Why in the world are you on the phone all day?" Others were listening now, waiting for her to explain herself. "Animals," she said, and then, "animal welfare," as if this would clarify her answer. Dumbfounded silence. "You mean to say that here you are, really sick with cancer, and you're standing there talking about animals all day? Are you mad?" This time the voice on the other end of the line belonged to Marion Webb. Yes, there were 2 Marions, Fitzgibbon, the one with cancer, and Webb, the healthy one. They both worked at the Irish Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ISPCA in Dublin. Though worked was not quite the right word, because it suggested a salary, and of course there was none. Everyone was a volunteer. Webb was the chairperson in charge. Fitzgibbon was the vice-chair, her number 2. Webb politely asked about Marion's health, then seamlessly shifted to business. "I've got news." Marion turned her head toward the hospital wall to shut out the glaring faces behind her. She wanted to concentrate on the voice coming through the receiver. "My husband is being transferred to Scotland," Webb announced, and paused a moment to let it sink in. "The company is quite eager to get us there quickly. They're even selling the house for us." A gurney rolled by. Heart monitors beeped. The nurse's station hummed along unperturbed. "When?" Marion asked. 3 weeks. Webb's British accent was perfect for this sort of stoic, we-must-carry-on message. "Look, I know you're sick right now, but you're going to have to take over. You're the vice chair. It's your time. Silence. I don't know. The doctor wants me to rest at home for 6 weeks. Then they're sending me to the radiation hospital in Dublin. She felt like she was halfway dead. In a day or two, she'd be diagnosed with an MRSA infection in the wound. Yes, and then it will be over. I know. It's very hard. A very hard time indeed. But the surgery went well. You're going to get better, and I'll make sure there's help for you. You won't have to do it all alone. There it was, the inevitable. Even as Marion stood leaning against the wall for support, with her armpit feeling like it had been hacked with a machete, even with a lump and 24 lymph nodes gone, she knew she'd do it. She would, because that was what she always did. It's your time, repeated Webb, and you are going to get well. A couple of days later, Webb arrived at the hospital with a large stack of folders. She handed them over one by one, explaining each. Here are the files for each shelter. This is the file for farm animals. Here's the folder for exotics. Webb had them all organized. Fundraising, budgets, financial projections, legislation. When they got to the last folder, Webb paused and took a breath. This is the greyhound situation, she said, holding up a thick file bursting with papers. Webb was unusual. She kept a greyhound herself as a pet, but that was because she was British, and British people were in general more advanced when it came to animal welfare, a fact that pained Marion. In Ireland, greyhounds were working animals and not considered suitable as pets. Out in the countryside, you'd see dogmen walking their greyhounds muzzled, so they looked like criminals, like savages. They were creatures of the track. A greyhound in the house? Never. The slow, the injured, the aging who could no longer race or breed, for the most part quietly disappeared. Did anyone know where they went? Yes, it was a terrible situation, Marion agreed, accepting the folder and thinking, yes, of course, someday, but not now. Soon even, but not now. Christ, a year earlier they'd rescued a greyhound from a garbage dump, the sweetest little bitch ever. She walked with a beautiful prance. They'd fed her, vaccinated her, put up posters all over the city trying to find her a good home. But no one called or came forth, not one person. People didn't care about greyhounds. Marion thanked Webb with sincerity and put the greyhound folder at the bottom of the stack. They wished each other good luck and said goodbye. Several months later, after finishing her radiation and inching up to 110 pounds on her 5-foot 7-inch frame, and after Marion Webb was resettled in Scotland, Marion put on what clothes she could find that didn't hang off her too terribly and set off in her car to deal with a situation that had been plaguing her for years. She had no particular plan. She just knew she had to drive about 20 miles and knock on the door. Her husband, John, had suggested more than once that she was always on the lookout for trouble. Sometimes when they walked out the front door, he made a public service announcement that all the hurt and needy animals of Ireland should come forth and show themselves to Marion Fitzgibbon. "She's coming out now. Here's your chance." Marion strenuously protested. She tried in vain again and again to explain to him that, in fact, she was most often trying to keep her head down so she would not see animals. Now, as she drove along the scruffy fields beneath the thick grey sky of autumn, she caught sight of the low-slung stone bungalow with turf smoke coming from the chimney. Up the long, narrow driveway, careful not to get her car wheels stuck in the mud. It took but a moment to catch sight of what she'd come for. The creature was chained to a tree, lying in the grass, a leather collar around its neck. "Jesus," she whispered, then parked the car and headed toward the front door of the farmhouse, her eyes all the while on the orange and black stripes down the long back and the large head lying on the ground. She took a breath and knocked. A tall, middle-aged man opened the door and looked at her with no expression at all. Marion introduced herself and gave her title. "I hear you're keeping tigers." "It's a pet," he said, looking at her with big grey eyes. He seemed only slightly antagonistic, and perhaps a bit weary, too. He'd been fighting for a long time, and probably had expected someone like Marion to come along eventually. Now she was here. She peered discreetly behind him. It was a modern-looking bungalow, with curtains and carpets and paintings on the walls, on a small farm. His name was Stafford Taylor, and he lived there with his family. She assumed he was a circus buff. Travelling circuses found such people who would accept cast-offs. Tigers and bears could only learn to do so many tricks, and if they made the same rounds year after year doing the same performances, the crowds became bored. It was not unusual for a circus to offer a pair of animals to a fan in return for the offspring, which they'd pick up the following summer when they made their rounds again. Owning a dog required a license, but you needed nothing to own a tiger. Some years earlier, the Limerick Leader had done a feature on Taylor and his tigers, a story of fatherly love. He'd had a dream of building a menagerie circus for his 12-year-old daughter. "Mind if I have a look?" Without waiting for his reply, Marion walked toward the yard. The baby tiger was about 6 months old and far too thin. He lay in the dirt, chained to a tree in front of the house. When he saw Marion, he tried to pull himself up, as if to greet her. But that's when things went terribly wrong. His knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground. Getting closer, Marion could see that the lower part of his back was deformed. He looked something like a seal, his feet useless as flippers for standing. After several more failed attempts to get up, the tiger began to drag himself toward her with his 2 front legs. Later, a vet would call it cage paralysis, an affliction of wild animals kept in captivity. "Where does this tiger stay at night?" Marion asked. Taylor pointed across the way at his garage. Based on the pressure sores on his joints, Marion could tell that he slept on a concrete floor. She glanced around and saw a low shed across the yard with a wood door bolted shut. What horror was inside? A post-cancer wooziness rolled over her. Her legs began to falter, so she looked away from Taylor and out at the road to steady herself. Just then a giant truck passed by, stacked with cages of tightly packed chickens on their way to slaughter. She later learned that there was a chicken factory just down the road, and this accounted for the acrid smell in the air, which was making her queasy. "Mr. Taylor, you can't keep these animals here anymore." Her voice rose more than she intended. She was fully aware that her emotions were getting away from her, and yet she couldn't help it. "We've had complaints from your neighbors. You can't continue. This baby tiger is in terrible health. Look at its legs. They're ulcerated from sleeping on a concrete floor. It's tied to a tree and can't move. It can't stand. This is all wrong." She pointed at the calf house. "Should I understand that you have 2 more tigers in there right now? A mother and father, yes?" He told her that they'd been way worse off before he took them. Then he nodded toward the yard, where he had built a little circus ring and several pallets made of slatted timbers. He'd had big plans to build a proper enclosure, but his neighbors fought it. What was he to do? His tone was righteous. Why he had not anticipated that the council would refuse to allow such plans was anyone's guess. His farm was near an elementary school. Marion could just imagine the gruesome possibilities if a tiger got loose. Of course the council was not going to endorse Mr. Taylor's dreams of a circus compound for his daughter. His neighbors did not help, but rather ridiculed and reviled him. Irish small-townism at its worst. He insisted that he'd rescued them and saved their lives. "Look, Mr. Taylor, this is totally unacceptable. How many babies have there been before this one? And I hear you've got a bear and 2 baboons." Taylor's weathered face clenched tighter, turning red. He turned his back and stomped off to his house, slamming the door shut. Marion stood in place, waiting, not sure what to do next. A minute later, the door opened and he emerged once again, this time carrying a rifle. He marched straight toward Marion and cocked it. Then he tossed the gun toward her. With an unexpected reflex, her arms reached out and caught it. She was surprised at the sudden cold weight of it in her hands. She looked up at him. "What do you want me to do?" "Go ahead," he told her. "Shoot him." Up until then, it had not been the ISPCA's policy to take on the cause of exotic and wild animals. At that point in Ireland, the Animal Protection Law of 1911 had been applied only to farm animals and domestic creatures. Nor did the ISPCA want to start reaching out to exotics, as they already had their hands full with tens of thousands of stray dogs and cats, and barely any funding. Just the same, Marion argued relentlessly at ISPCA council meetings, until she got them finally to agree to take Stafford Taylor to court. After many months of effort, the ISPCA won the case, and won custody of the circus animals, setting a new precedent. For a moment, Marion was overjoyed, but then she realized there was serious work to do. The judge had set a 2-month deadline for the ISPCA to find an appropriate home for the menagerie, which totaled 2 baboons, 1 Canadian black bear, and the 2 Siberian tigers, plus their poor deformed baby. If appropriate homes were not found within 60 days, the animals would be destroyed. It was November. They had till just past Christmas. This was before the internet, which meant days and days on the phone with every animal welfare organization in Europe, begging for help. The local television news did a feature on the plight of Taylor's circus animals, and the newspapers did stories too. Yet no one came forward. Marion questioned herself. Had she made a mistake? When she went to court, she had hardly understood the gravity of finding new homes for tigers and bears. Who would even know how to sedate them properly or transport them? Every vet she called refused, saying the same thing. "Tigers, baboons, bears. We have no experience with exotics. Sorry." The vet world in Ireland was a small club that tended to agree on most issues. Only one vet on the entire island was trained for such things, and he was at the Dublin Zoo and unable to leave. Who would mind his bears and tigers if something should go wrong while he was gone? In the meantime, the animals needed care, as they were all starving and malnourished. How in the world to feed 3 Siberian tigers? How to pay for it? Marion's only idea was to go to the nearest meat factory, 26 miles away, and ask for help. A man in a blood-speckled white apron and hat squinted at her, unsure of what she was saying. Marion told him about the tigers from the circus, how they were being kept in terrible conditions, starving and thin, one paralyzed from the waist down. They needed food. It was a desperate situation. Had he heard about it on the news? Was there anything they could offer? What could he say to a frighteningly thin lady who was feeding tigers, claiming to be chair of the ISPCA? He told her to meet him round the back. Marion drove her car around to the loading bay, where the big doors opened to a rack of cows hanging from their hooves. A small crew of men emerged in their blood-spattered uniforms, carrying crates of raw meat, which they loaded into the boot of her car. Meat ends and offal, and even a bit of rump or shoulder as well, all of it smelling of blood and death. The factory gave her enough to last a week. Driving back to Taylor's, she tried not to think of the flesh and organs in the car, telling herself all the while, tigers need meat. The disgusting odor of chicken processing hung over Taylor's land, and again nausea mixed with Marion's post-radiation fatigue. She presented the meat to Taylor, who, along with his wife, was cooperative. Taylor had known for a long time that he was in over his head, and now he saw an end. They did not discuss that the animals had been living imprisoned in darkness and half-starved. Taylor unloaded the meat and walked to the calf house. He opened the doors and threw the meat inside. The bear, on the other hand, was a vegetarian. Though she was female, for some odd reason her stage name was Clyde. Taylor had bought a circus ring for her, but she didn't use the space. Instead, she stayed huddled inside a hut he'd built out of flimsy wood, which gave her little protection from the endless rain and damp of the Irish weather. Her fur was matted and full of parasites, and she continually scratched herself. rocking back and forth with the repetitious rhythms that animals adopt when under great stress. She was extremely thin. Marion brought Clyde fruit and nuts, which she left at the door of her hut. "Here you go," said Marion. The bear lumbered out on 4 legs, snatched up the food, and raced back to her corner. This Canadian black bear, a species that evolved over millions of years to wander across acres of woods, had been so conditioned to confinement that she now feared open space. Marion gave in to her temptation and stepped to the edge of the hut to look inside. Clyde raised her head and looked back blankly at Marion. The funny thing about black bears is how they can look at you and seem like dogs, their intelligent eyes peering over gold-coloured snouts. You might feel like you could have a conversation with the bear and possibly pet it. The fact that they can stand on their hind legs only adds to the illusion that they might be friendly to humans. In fact, Marion felt a desire to step inside and pet the bear and console her. Of course she knew better and never would. She'd heard that circus bears were trained to dance by being forced to stand on hot plates. She hummed a tune, the Blue Danube. To her shock, after the first few notes, Clyde dropped her fruit on the muddy ground and stood upright, then began to turn in circles. Marion's heart lurched, and she began slowly backing away. But instead of approaching her, the bear continued to dance. Clyde lifted her forelegs as though making a circle above her head as she did a pirouette, like a doll whose dancing button had been pressed. Then, after a few minutes of this humiliation, she went back to eating her fruit. Brendan Price was at home in Dublin when he saw the story on the evening news. He greatly respected Marion Fitzgibbon, but knew immediately that she was out of her depth. How would she find sanctuaries for tigers, a bear, and 2 baboons, then get them off the farm safely? A tiger could take off your arm in a heartbeat. He'd seen it happen. Brendan specialised in handling wildlife and exotics. He'd been a keeper at the Dublin Zoo for 9 years. He'd also founded, along with his wife Mary, the Irish Seal Sanctuary, which focused on rescuing and rehabilitating grey seal pups that were frequently orphaned on Irish beaches after storms. He collected them, fed them, and gave them time to learn to swim in pools he'd built in his backyard. When they were ready, he released them back into the ocean. He had never planned to get involved in animal welfare work. Ensuring the good health of the animals in his care was not an emotional matter. It had simply been part of his job. But during those years at the zoo, he had witnessed things that changed him. 2 polar bears swam like zombies, back and forth in the same loop in the same tiny pool year after year. A pair of hippos lived in a pool hardly bigger than themselves, with a trickle of water in which to bathe. Sea lions spent their lives in a pool so heavily chlorinated that the water burned their eyes. For years, Brendan had tried to highlight problems and seek solutions from the inside, but he was frustrated with management's indifference. Then 2 elephants, Judy and Debbie, pushed him to his limit. They were in terrible condition, and no one at the zoo knew what to do, nor did they seek appropriate help. When Brendan arrived in the mornings, he often found them swivelling on their bottoms, unable to get up. When one died, he was devastated. Without permission from the director, he invited a world-renowned elephant expert to come to the zoo and inspect the remaining elephant, then advise on her care. It was a marvellous meeting. The famous vet was full of ideas on how they could work together, and finally Brendan felt hopeful. The next day he was cleaning the bat house and got word that the director wanted to see him. He was sacked on the spot. This marked the beginning of his transformation. Brendan spoke out to the media, exposing the wrongs he'd seen. He made trouble at the meetings of the National Zoological Society, demanding transparency and data on animal births and deaths. His protests ultimately contributed to a government inquiry and investment of £15 million for zoo improvements. He attended ISPCA meetings too, where he sometimes got carried away, pounding his hand on the table and asking why the ISPCA wasn't doing something for exotic animals. As vice-chair and later as chair, Marion respected Brendan and understood that he was an exceptional hands-on animal man who put welfare first. He'd figured out things about marine animals that no one else yet knew, like how to keep grey seal pups alive by feeding them liquidized fish. She always tried to support him and found a little bit in her budget for his seal sanctuary. When no one would give him a job, she invited him to join the ISPCA Governing Council to advise them on exotics. In short, she believed in him. She brought him in from the Shadowlands, the place where all whistleblowers go. That's why when Brendan Price saw Marion on the evening news with Stafford Taylor's circus animals, there was no question in his mind that he would be getting himself on a train to Limerick. After several weeks of despair, Marion felt joy at the sight of Brendan at her door with a rucksack on his back, ready to serve. Soon he was calling sanctuaries all over the world in search of a place that would accept tigers or bears. He also set about finding a vet who was qualified to sedate the large exotics for transport, whenever and to wherever that would be. He reached out to Samantha Lindsay, a young vet in England, who was then just emerging as an advocate for elephants and other animals who are abused and abandoned by travelling circuses. Lindsay agreed to come and help. Next, Brendan persuaded a particularly humane member of the Garda, the Irish police, to help. And this was essential, because without police support, they would not have the authority to set foot on Taylor's land. Also, Brendan wanted Taylor to see he was serious, that a prosecution was coming and the game was up. An unexpected complication emerged when they learned that the mother tiger was pregnant. "Pregnant?" Marion gasped. Taylor insisted that Marion couldn't take the new baby because he owed it to the circus. It was true. They didn't have the right to the baby. The ISPCA had to go back to court, and Marion had to testify once more about how inhumane it was to keep tigers in such poor conditions and in such a dangerously insufficient enclosure on a farm in Limerick, locked up in the dark. The judge extended custody of all the offspring of the captive animals to the ISPCA, and from that point forward, Taylor and his wife were cooperative. Brendan let them know that he understood their good intentions toward the animals, but also helped them understand that they needed expert help. It was the only way to get out of the mess they'd created. Stafford Taylor wasn't cruel. In fact, he'd probably acquired the animals in the first place because he was an animal lover. Price had seen this sort of thing before. The travelling circus needed to unload some tigers, so they set up a ruse, perhaps in a pub, asking if anyone wanted to take a tiger, because, if not, the poor thing would have to be shot that night. It was usually the softest-hearted animal lover who stood up and said, "Me, yes, I'll take him." Somehow it got worked out that there would be 2 tigers who would breed, and the circus would come back the following season for the babies. It wasn't long before the whole thing got out of control. The tigers were locked up in the dark, and yes, when the baby was born it was cute. But then it grew up and ate the dog. Next it started eyeing the children. Then it was sent to the garage. The expense and the isolation, it all got too much for the tiger keeper. Neighbours who used to love the baby tiger started making terrified complaints about the roaring. Before you knew it, the kind-hearted one, the very same animal lover who saved a life in the first place, was accused of abuse. Marion found one local vet who agreed to handle the deformed baby tiger, and only the baby tiger. Because of his size, he was much less of a threat than his parents. She was not surprised when the vet told her that the only compassionate thing was to put the animal down, as he could not stand or walk, and no one in the world would take a disabled, misshapen baby tiger. The humane method was a 2-step process. First a barbiturate to sedate, then an intravenous injection to bring cardiac arrest. If you skipped the first step, the animal might have seizures and suffer while dying. While the vet assembled his syringe, he and Marion discussed the safest way to approach the tiger. They planned to come from behind and quickly inject the tranquilizer into his back hip. Taylor intervened. This wasn't necessary, he said, because the tiger was tame. They should just go up and give it the needle. "We're taking precautions, Mr. Taylor," Marion answered in her cases-closed voice. "The ISPCA has already put me on notice that we aren't insured for putting down a tiger, not even a baby. We can't have any accidents." It was raining hard, yet the baby lay chained to the tree, looking peacefully toward them without an
Sample complete. Ready to continue?